And I think that is such a huge, gigantic, untapped potential we all have to transform how we work, simply at some level by changing the mind we bring to it. And nobody's ever taught us how to do that.
Hello, friends, and welcome. I am delighted to be with a very special friend. In this episode of Insights at the Edge, my guest is Jeremy Hunter. Jeremy is a global authority on mindfulness and leadership, as well as the great-grandson of a sumo wrestler. He serves as the founding director of the Executive Mind Leadership Institute, as well as the associate professor of practice at the Peter F. Drucker School of Management. Jeremy's work is informed by the experience of living day to day for almost 2 decades now with a potentially terminal illness, and we'll be talking about that. For 8 times, he's been awarded the Teacher of the Year award by his students, and when faced with the need for life-saving surgery, more than a dozen former students came forward as organ donors. Jeremy's also part of the core faculty of the Inner MBA, which is a 9-month online immersion training program that Sounds True has created in partnership with LinkedIn and Wisdom 2.0. Each year, we take one cohort through the Inner MBA, and it starts in September. You can learn more at innermbaprogram.com. Jeremy, welcome.
Hi, Tami. How are you?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Yeah, good.
All right. Right here at the beginning, something I don't know about you. It's interesting. We've had lots of conversations, but I don't know. How did your life path become focused on being this bridge between, this is how I see it, the deep spiritual journey and leadership and organizational transformation? How did that become your focus?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the late 1990s, I was studying at the University of Chicago with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who I think everybody knows is the founder of Flow. And we were doing a series of research projects under the umbrella of good work. And the Fetzer Institute and the Nathan Cummings Foundation gave us a grant to study quote unquote successful professionals who are also long-term mindfulness practitioners. So this is the late 1990s, right? Which is a completely different, I think, psychological world. And so even at that time, to have somebody publicly admit they were a meditator was not easy, frankly, right? And through the good graces of Mirabai Bush and the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, we found really remarkable people. And Robert Shapiro, the former chairman of Monsanto, being one of them, and world famous movie producers, world renowned architects, as well as journalists, therapists, people who were making a living using their mind, basically. And I would go interview them. And we would ask a question like something that would be impossible to answer, like, what do you think your life would be like if you didn't have this practice? And again, this is the late 1990s, so very different world, no mobile technology, none of the craziness we live with right now. They would say something like, I'm being pulled in so many directions at once that if I didn't have this practice to keep me grounded, centered, and sane, I think I'd be dead. And like a third of the people we talked to said I'd be dead. And I realized that everybody needed this kind of practice. And of course, I would have been dead too. You mentioned I had this. I was 20 when I was diagnosed with this autoimmune disease. And I turned it into basically a spiritual adventure. And I'm sitting there listening to these people, taking notes, thinking, oh yeah, you'd be dead too, Jeremy. And so then at the end of the 90s, we moved from Chicago to the Drucker School in Claremont. And of course, I think people know Peter Drucker is considered to be the founding father of the discipline of management and truly one of the great intellects of his time, maybe of all time. He's quite an amazing human being. And he wrote, extensively about so many things, but one of them, which caught my eye, was the notion that we have overtrained in analysis and we have undertrained in perception. We train people to think, but we don't teach them to see. And when I found that kind of blew my mind. Now, he was a prodigious collector of Japanese painting, Japanese ink brush painting. And he said that Japanese art taught him how to see the world. And so this notion of developing perception, if you were a meditator, that would make sense. But I think if you were just a normal person, that would make no sense at all. Like, what the heck does that mean? Develop perception. And then the final thing was a colleague of mine, Jean Lippman Blumen, also a legend in her own right, said to me offhandedly in the hallway, it was like one of those moments that you don't see coming, but they totally change your life. And she says, Jeremy, we train managers to manage everything but themselves. And then in that moment, everything came together. I thought, wow, you have these people who are living fairly intense lives, saying, if I didn't have this practice, I'd be dead. You had me thinking, oh yeah, you'd be dead too. You have Drucker talking about developing perception to see a world that's there, not the world that you assume is there. So you can adapt to it. He was thinking about this in terms of how do you adapt to change? How do you actually deal with the world? And then my colleague saying, oh yeah, we don't teach managers to manage themselves. And so it all came together and I realized, oh, everybody needs this kind of thing. And that as we've talked about before, the balance of Western education is so biased towards thinking and cognition to the exclusion of, somatic sensing or emotion or perception and all the other human faculties that we can develop. And I think also being half Japanese really underscored something for me, because I think anybody who's been to Japan knows Japan is fundamentally a society of perception, and that it's a perceptual society, which means that attention and stability and attention is a highly prized cultural aspect. Even with my own team, like their quality of attention is just so much more. I have a business in Japan, and we meet on Zoom regularly every week, and their quality of attention in those meetings is so incredible. I mean, it's better than mine, frankly, but people are there. Presence is valued as a cultural quality. And I think kind of living in between these worlds and seeing how one society, which we're kind of an attention, like the United States is a kind of attention deficit society. And then you have another society, which is almost totally the opposite, and how much attention is paid to even the most minute detail. And then oftentimes in the service of making that detail beautiful, has been I think kind of an interesting way of going through life. But that's the long answer to your question of like, how did all these dots connect? And and then the challenge was, how do you talk to business people who aren't, or managers? We're not a school of business, we're a school of management. How do you talk to decision makers and managers who may not be interested in a spiritual journey about this kind of thing in a way that they would find relevant, not just relevant in their life, but an absolute necessity? And that was the next challenge. But that's the answer to the question.
I'm curious to know more about the quality of perception that Peter F. Drucker was pointing to, and how, like, even right now in this moment, could I do a perceptual exercise to start to connect with the quality of perception that he was pointing to?
Yeah, I can give you one that's actually documented on the internet, and of somebody who came to visit him, and he brought this topic up, like, can you see the world that's actually in front of you? Because most of the time we're projecting that through the filters in our head that we don't, and then distorting what's actually happening. And she said, okay. And he sat her in front of one of the ink brush paintings in his office. And he said, how many colors are there? And she says, 2, black and white. And And he says, really? And she looks at it and she looks at it and she looks at it and she goes, oh, I realized, there were 1,000 shades of gray. And that he said, living with these paintings day in and day out and having a relationship with them is really what honed his quality of perception.
And then make the bridge to me to organizational life, to being effective as a business human once we cultivate this type of subtle perception of what's real, what's actually in front of us.
Yeah, wonderful. So that's easy. So you have a meeting with your most difficult client. What are the assumptions, emotional reactions, expectations, judgments you walk in with even before that meeting has started? And how do all of those filters distort your capacity to be present and clear in that engagement? And oftentimes it's so automatic and so invisible and so fast, we don't see any of those things, and you're already headlong into a reaction, and it's distorting the outcome. One of my favorite stories about this process, I was working with a group of financial advisors, and they were like the top financial advisors in the country, and like one of their rewards was to spend time with me, and what a dubious reward. But anyway, I asked them to think about their most difficult client, and a fellow in the back of the room, his name was George, like throws up his hands and says, "Oh God, Joan!" And Joan was his most difficult client, and I said, "Okay, what's the story in your head about Joan?" And he says, "Oh, that's easy. Joan wakes up to ruin my day." And every time they had a phone conversation, it would end with frustration on both sides. And I said, "Okay, so like your homework is to see if you can transform this relationship by letting go of the stuff you're bringing to it." And because he was, quite good at his job, and I think he wanted to be better. We met 3 months later. And he said, I said, "So what happened?" And he said, "Well, I didn't wait for Joan to call me. I got back to the office on Monday and I called her. And the phone is ringing. Someone picks up the phone and I hear a frail old lady's voice say hello." And he said, in that moment, I saw how my assumption that here's a woman who wakes up to ruin my day was completely wrong. And then it occurred to him that her husband was his client. He died. He was the one who managed all the money. She didn't have any kind of financial acumen whatsoever. And so whenever she's calling him from a place of real anxiety about her future. And he said, I took personally this anxiety she's projecting on me. And I realized this is someone's grandma who's just worried about her future. And like, what a jerk am I to have all these reactions around her, and worse than that, allow them to affect the outcome. And like once the moment he heard the frailty in her voice, he said, my heart broke open to her. And I talked to her as if she was my grandmother. And it completely changed their relationship. And so, if we talk about something, more management like productivity, we tend to think of productivity as a linear phenomenon. I'll be more productive if I just work harder. But if you think about the productivity in that relationship, in that conversation, the productivity gain, if we want to talk about it that way, was instantaneous simply because he changed his mind, right? And so they didn't have to work on the relationship. They didn't have to keep talking and hash things out. He simply changed his mind. And the world changed and their relationship changed. And so we don't think about these things as being impactful on something like productivity, but it's there, it's clear, right? And and I think that is such a huge, gigantic, untapped potential we all have to transform how we work, simply at some level by changing the mind we bring to it. And nobody's ever taught us how to do that. And so what I try to do is help people see how it is they're constructing their experience. How are they constructing their reality? What are the stories they bring to something? What are the unhealed traumas that they're projecting on a situation that distort it and distort the outcome? How do their emotional reactions damage a relationship? And then you always tie that back to the outcome. What's the result? Is that result the one you wanted, or did it go in a place you didn't want it to go? And by making it tangible like that, then you take these topics which can so all too easily be filed away in the woo-woo box to something that is incredibly practical and I think an absolute necessity for this ever more challenging and interesting world we live in. Like, how do you transform your mind, and how do you do it in real time? I don't know. Does that answer your question?